We are here present for life and peace. The people are here present for life and peace. People are here present for the people and the peace. For life and peace. The people are present here for life and peace. Welcome. Welcome. We bring deep love from Venezuela at this gathering amongst nations and peoples. So welcome everyone. Well, thank you, Monica. In Venezuela, we call that a sangueo, the ceremony. Monica will explain it later. And I want to welcome you all. It's a great pleasure to be able to hold a conversation with Venezuelan feminists. My name is Leonardo Flores. I'm from Venezuela, and I work with Code Pink. Code Pink, DSA, and the Simón Bolívar Institute in Caracas joined together to bring this brigade of Venezuelan women on a 7-city tour of the United States, where they have met with elected officials and communities to denounce murderous U.S. sanctions and their disproportionate impacts on women and children. Their tour is ending in LA, and it's fantastic that they're here at the People's Summit for Democracy. This summit challenges us not to only imagine how to build but build a better world. In Venezuela, the people have been doing that just that for 23 years. A few miles away, in the Summit of Exclusion, the United States will talk a great deal about democracy and human rights, but the United States talks about democracy and human rights, but what democracy, what is the democracy in taking a virtually unknown politician and naming him the so-called interim president of Venezuela? Where's the democracy in attempting coups, financing violent protests, engaging in covert operations, and threatening a country with military action? Where are the human rights in imposing cruel sanctions that destroyed Venezuela's economy and led to the deaths of 100,000 people? The government of the United States has no moral authority to talk about human rights or democracy, but I'm honored to be sitting next to 3 women who do. In Venezuela, we're building a participatory and protagonist democracy. Yolimar, Anggie, and Mónica are perfect examples of women who have been protagonists in the struggle for campesina, farm worker, indigenous, and black recognition and rights. And like them, there are millions of people in Venezuela resisting a hybrid war and building a better world. So let's start with Yolimar. Yolimar is an industrial engineer, member of the International Brigade of the Workers Without Land, the LST, and she was part of the movement to offer training against sexual harassment. And she has worked in the International Institute, whose mission is to provide training for adults. And so, Yolimar, I'm going to start with a few questions. The sanctions have had the most impact on oil shortages. Can you talk about how those impacts and why Venezuela, an oil-rich country, has experienced fuel shortages? Secondly, how have people and farmers responded to the sanctions and its impacts on food? Well, First of all, I would like to express deep gratitude on my behalf, on my comrades' behalf. We are truly excited to be here, stretching these solidarity links and participating in such an important event that, as Leonardo mentioned, is an alternative event to the summit that supposedly convenes all of the American countries, but we know that that's not the case. So I'm very thankful that you all are here and that you are here. In this session, we feel honored, we feel further committed, and we consider this gathering of ours to be one of the key actions to stop the blockade that currently exists against Venezuela. So thank you for being here. In regards to the question, Leo, yes, effectively, these sanctions, and this is a misnomer of a term because these are unilateral measures that the United States is imparting on whoever they want. And we in Venezuela, we have lived through this firsthand, especially since 2015, which the president at the time, Barack Obama, declared that Venezuela was an unusual threat to the United States. And so from that point on, a base was established, a legal base was established to define a series of actions, processes, and politics that are illegal from the international standpoint, that outlines what people's autonomy can be, on what outlines self-determination. And so these sanctions were against our petroleum industry, right, our oil industry. As you all may know, Venezuela is an economic model that has an economic model based on oil and on oil extraction. And one of the proposals that the Bolivarian revolution proposes is a shift from that model, because we know that it's important to transcend that economic model. We know that that resource, oil as a resource, has great international interests, including from the U.S. And so understanding that Venezuela's economy is oil-based, you know, this is not just us saying this, but the U.S. administration has also admitted to this, that they intend to attack Venezuela so that they give up and that they move, and that they also give up the construction of a socialist economic model. And so it would then be necessary to attack Venezuela's economic center, that center being the oil resources. And so, for example, it is Venezuela is forbidden from selling its oil. Therefore, we're forbidden from exporting the oil, and this creates limits and freezes on financial transactions between Venezuela, and it becomes impossible to receive payments upon selling any amount of oil or petroleum. And therefore, it becomes impossible for Venezuela economy to access capital that allows them to produce gas or diesel and supply the rest of the country with these resources. And so with these barriers established around Venezuela's oil industry, this creates impacts on not only Venezuela's oil economy, but it's derivatives as well. And so how then is it possible to transport people, to have other commercial exchanges? And so that was a huge blow on Venezuela's agricultural industrial economy, because it became impossible to transport raw materials. And because of that, we need to remember that as Venezuela was looking for alternatives to exporting their gasoline or importing their gasoline, then we also saw sanctions or lateral measures being imposed upon countries that were selling these resources to Venezuela. And this is also the case with diesel, because in the case of Venezuela, there is a lot of machinery, agricultural machinery, that requires the use of diesel. And so we saw how this sector was also gravely affected. And so despite all of the attacks that the oil industry has suffered, an industry which I was part of for more than 10 years, it is important to highlight the courage, the bravery, and the commitment of the workers who are still in that industry, in that business, because they are putting in hours and hours of work to push forward an industry for which sanctions severely affected, not only in regards to gasoline production, but also the oil fields, in the operations of the oil fields. So knowing that the Venezuelan economy is based on the oil sector, and so we need to understand that this sector has been in existence for longer than 100 years. And so there's a very key role that technology and U.S. businesses play, because the technological source, the technological source of the oil industry in Venezuela does derive from the U.S. So if there are U.S. businesses working in, if there were U.S. businesses working in Venezuela upon these sanctions being implemented, they should have left as well. They left as well and took with them that technology. And so that also had a great impact. And so these efforts to improve the oil refineries were also hindered. And so a lot of this work was really held back and delayed. So there were a lot of issues in being able to produce gasoline with the few supplies that we had. So this really created a grave impact upon the whole supply chain of the oil industry. So I repeat, the workers of this oil industry in Venezuela have a fundamental role in creating a new progressive direction in which they are leaning on international support to reestablish their operations. And from an agricultural standpoint, as our comrade mentioned, I am in support of a very important brigade that has been in existence since 2005 in Venezuela, and they have been learning with us since then. And we have been working together to establish our own production of food. So we have been strengthening the chains of food sovereignty, rescuing our seeds. In Venezuela, there is a law, I don't want to be arrogant, but it's one of the most advanced policies in regards to the preservations of native seeds in Venezuela. And we have been working with indigenous communities, with farm workers through different organizations to build education about the importance of preserving, of rescuing our seeds, our own crops, because obviously, as a with the oil culture that we have, petroleum culture that we have, it used to be a country that was exporting a lot of processed food. And so little by little, we are rescuing a vision of a healthy and sovereign food and food sources. And so there we also cultivate that struggle and that resistance that our people carry. And despite all of the challenges that we've encountered, these people have refocused their efforts to work the land. So you all may know of some of the biggest policy processes of redistribution of the land. And in and because of this, primarily, we saw that the U.S. supported a coup d'etat in 2002 in Venezuela. And so we have, we understand in Venezuela that the land belongs to those who work it. And so people have begun organizing production brigades across national geographies. And little by little, we see national production increasing on a national level. So I don't know if there's any other questions, but that's it from me. Thank you.
So now we're going to continue with Anggie, and she's from the communities of YU, and she works for the rights for Indigenous peoples. Before this, she was vice president of the Instituto Municipal for Women in Maracaibo, and it's the largest university in Venezuela, and she's an active member of Cosecha Feminista Cimarrón and Nosotros Violeta social movement. And can you please talk to us a little bit about the role of women in the revolution and how sanctions disproportionately impact women, and what are the impacts the YU have felt most directly? And finally, are sanctions a factor in Venezuelan migration? Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So first of all, I am very grateful for everyone present. For us, it's really important the fact that we are here. It eliminates some of the barriers in regards to communication, because everyone hears the truth from people who have had a particular perspective, but not people that have lived in Venezuela and what we experience and how we experience sanctions in Venezuela. So this is my area of work, the issue of human rights, and mainly for women and for Indigenous peoples. I live in a territory that is in the border of Colombia. It's established border, and in that state, for the YU communities, there's about 4 or 5 other populations, Yupa, Lavari, and Apreria, and Anu. And all of us are at the border areas. I'm on the side of the Colombia by Guajira and Anu, and the other communities are in the border by the interpreter couldn't hear. The sanctions and the way they've impacted us is in multiple forms, mainly with the arrival of the revolution. Women have been able to be empowered in a very important way, because what we've achieved, the majority of those projects and programs were led by women. And I'm talking about the Indigenous communities, because one of the constituents that participated in other organizations from the base, they they developed the new constitution so that it would be, um, so it could be a law that supported indigenous communities, their territories, culture, and languages. Dr. Norey did this, and after all those processes, the construction of the models of education and health, of how uh, pedagogically we should educate children of indigenous communities, because it's not the same to teach indigenous communities at their native language, that they think first of all in their mother tongue and then they learn Spanish. So there's a specific pedagogy with children, and that needs to be applied with people who are bilingual and who speak two languages. So to do that curriculum design, from reading and writing, and so that it would be embedded in the laws and it could be applied in the 6 states where there's indigenous populations. In addition, the model of intercultural help, and that they should eliminate the barriers regarding communication when a patient who doesn't speak Spanish needs to be seen by a doctor who doesn't understand them. There were dictionaries created with medical terminology so that the doctor, when they speak and they speak the language, the indigenous language, the other person can be able to feel more open in sharing what they feel and what they're experiencing. So based on that, that was pretty important and impactful. And we have seen many people impacted by these sanctions. Because of these achievements in 2015, with the low rate of petroleum, we weren't able to continue the programs in general. So Venezuela has always experienced crisis when the prices of oil is reduced. But what was different than other years is that there was an understanding that oil is not a renewable resource, and that we couldn't only depend on that, and that we needed to diversify the economy. And the people agreed with that and really understood that that's what should happen. And there were already advanced projects focused on this. So when all these processes began, the assembly took this on, and they wanted to make a change of these laws and everything that favored of things that were traditionally excluded, like indigenous folks, Afro communities. And when they realized they couldn't do anything, they came here and pressured even more. So when they saw that they couldn't, with all those years, they couldn't, with through a coup or through any other mechanism, then the position of the people, who were also convinced of the processes and the changes that they were experiencing, they knew that the only way that they could do this to us is by a fixed economy and sanction the government, the president, and give sanctions in every area where we saw that there was some hope to be able to, and say, oh, this is going to be the mechanism where we're going to have a solution to such issue. They would attack us. The cheapest thing in Venezuela were vegetables. And they began sanctioning, and like the gasoil was the most economic, cheapest thing. And so the crops would just stay there with the farm workers, and it was more difficult for them to mobilize. And so they were always trying to figure out how to asphyxiate the economy. And it wasn't just focused on oil anymore. So, they would fix prices wherever they could, and through any other mechanism. And then we started to see forced migration in Venezuela of folks who are super valuable and professional teachers, doctors, and all of that in the social investment that the state did with people who got three, four different titles like masters and doctorates. The president called this the crop of petroleum, and they always saw this as a social investment. So to see these folks migrate and see them in the borders and to experience all types of things, the fact that these folks got into all different types of situations like violence and so on, and they were being used by people who did human trafficking, and they don't see it in that way, but that is exactly what was happening, and it should be called that. It's human trafficking. And women and girls are the most vulnerable in these situations. Aside from, well, I always say this is the like a secret, right? Interpersonal violence, intrafamilial violence, domestic violence. When we're talking about the precarious resources and to have to stay with your partner, with your family, and aside from that, having to migrate. So all those things that were easy for people just to go to the supermarket and find rice and come back, that wasn't easy. It became a huge mission, right? To take care of children and to go to work wasn't possible anymore, and so women needed to stay home. And it's going back 30 years what women would do at home. They needed to stay home, take care of the children, be go to the supermarket, and if you couldn't find that product in one place, you needed to go somewhere else, and it was more expensive, and money was never enough. And the issue of wages that weren't enough and that were imposed on us, the dollar was imposed into our economy. And to reduce and get rid of our national money, and it was a symbol for every state to have your national currency, and to have to change to another type of currency, and that was worth more than your own currency. That was pretty significant because people were always looking for the dollar instead, and so it showed up as the strongest currency. And that forced migration caused this. And then there were people who were persecuted politically. People were looking for asylum or TPS. And that also, in a way, nourishes the sanctions. So they would say, oh, well, you have a lot of political people who are politically persecuted, and you have a strict regime. And so people left Venezuela because they tell them you can live in any other country except Venezuela because that's better. And aside from that, they sell the American dream, right? You can be better in the US or in any other country, but not in Venezuela. So the truth is, it's pretty sad and unfortunate. Many people who professionals can't exercise their careers here in the US, whether they're doctors or anything. They need to they just have to take any job they can find and get. And the topic about sanctions about and migration, it's pretty difficult because that forced migration, and it's what we've called the hybrid war, because they couldn't apply other traditional models in Venezuela like they did in other countries in Latin America, because there would be a coup and that was it. But in Venezuela, they applied different techniques because they knew it wouldn't be easy. And in addition to that, the ones who apply the sanctions aren't the people who migrated by force, but the traditional families in Venezuela, which were the owners of the oil companies. And they weren't interested in bringing up the country, but they wanted to manage the resources of Venezuela and bring them to the U.S. And that applies to the majority of the rich families in Latin America. So they just want the resources from their state and live here in the U.S. And that is why they accept and become subordinate of the leaders and the sanctions that the U.S. Applies. So that is all. So now we'll continue with Monica. She's a professor of the arts and focused on the traditional drumming in Venezuela. And she's a professor of literature and culture of national experimental arts in university and writes a regular column for online magazine. And she's pursuing, Monica also manages Herencia drumming group that seeks to preserve Afro-Venezuelan musical traditions through research, workshops, and performances. She is currently pursuing specialized in cultural economy in UNERTE and in Black Studies of Latin America. Can you please explain to us the Sengeo? And can you speak about the role women played in the revolution and how Monica, how have sanctions impacted cultural production in Venezuela? And I know this is very personal to you. Good afternoon. Every poem between you and I, every song, and the mini practice of this drum as making concrete the solidarity that exists in the fact that you can hear us and that we're meeting here at this event. It's a rupture. And the fact that you're spokespeople and you can learn about what we are experiencing in Venezuela shows that the love and resistance that we have in our country is being heard. And so we want to offer a lot of solidarity and gratitude.
Wow, let me explain what we did at the beginning. That drumming and singing that you heard called sanguineo is what has made us, since the beginning of time of the Afro-Venezuelan community, been what keeps us going. But since 2015, it has been our spiritual salvation. Spirituality is the strength that characterizes us as a Venezuelan culture. Sangueo is a ceremonial rhythm that is played actually in this month of June, in which we honor San Juan Bautista, Saint John the Baptist. So I want to ask you all, do you all honor Saint John, the one who baptized Christ from the Catholic tradition? So raise your hand if you have that tradition. Okay. Well, we know that Catholicism is a Christian-imposed practice. However, in conquered territories that also experienced slavery, we also birth a syncretism of indigenous and Afro practices. And so amid this painful crossing of syncretizing of practices, we see this ceremony in which we honor Saint John the Baptist, right? So this is the day that this saint was born, and this was the only day that was given off to enslaved people in Venezuela. And so this story is adapted from Christianity, but through this celebration, we manifest a form of liberation. And that is why today we started this space with the sangueo to meet each other with a cry for liberation, denouncing the oppression of communities all across the world. So yes, it's a sangueo from us to you all, but so that you can all see your own oppressions reflected back. And through this, we remember, we are reclaim this practice, this Afro-Indigenous practice, and we visibilize the drum. First of all, we also have a celebration in December that was declared in December of the UNESCO declared the drum and this practice as a Venezuelan patrimony. And in Venezuela, we have been able to integrate a lot of these patrimonial celebrations into international recognition. And this happened throughout many of the sanctions that have been imposed. And for purposes of time, we're only going to use the term sanctions, even though other terms could be applied to what these practices are. But as my comrades have shared what we have experienced as a people, our empowerment, and the fact that they have named that sanctions are a punishment for what we have accomplished. So everything that we have been able to conquer or accomplish as a community, one of our strengths as a Venezuelan people is that we are a people who take action from a community standpoint. And that is our best strategy against imperialism. They have wanted to divide us, to conquer us. And I want to get back to Leo's question about cultural production. When we are lacking of food and healthy food, we have a phrase that Venezuelans say, and that is, where one person eats, two people can eat, and many more will eat. And so we really take this approach in order to address the lack of food access that we have, not only in Venezuela, but in the world. And you know, if we look at these food indicators, food index indicators on an international level, and we also heard that President Barack Obama declare us as an unusual and extraordinary threat. This caused a different understanding of what our own food sovereignty would look like. And now in 2022, this idea that we can be have sovereignty in terms of food is still being challenged. And we know that our commander Chavez prepared us for these kind of situations. You know, we understand that we have to stay ready, and we've had that kind of training and education around that. We've also had to reinvent ourselves as we have been cornered after President Barack Obama and Trump really deepened that idea of the fact that we lack the ability to be food sovereign. And so how did we approach this issue? Yes, our calorie rationing did decrease. However, at the same time, this Bolivarian revolution has been a process in practice of experimenting and relaunching our practice of the 3 R's of revolution, of revisioning, of reintegrating, and we began deepening our community practice in growing our own food. So if we have been lacking transport to transport food, then as a community we began looking at recreating maps to transport our food across the country. And so, as I mentioned, throughout these 7 years of sanctions, we have not stopped producing. However, cultural production in our country has decreased. And when I speak of this, I speak of the cultural industries in our country. So in 2014, I'm going to give you a specific example of what has happened with a lot of groups and organizations who have been self-organized and autonomous. There has been at an institutional level that has supported cultural production. And so we see this ghost sponsorship also coming on a public level. So we have had many cultural congresses, and we have held many spaces in which the voices of Afro people, indigenous people have been highlighted. And so we have a history. Those of us who have been silenced, we are put to the center. And so many cultural institutions have provided the platform for us to showcase our work and share our cultural practices. And so, it's complex to be able to showcase our work on an international level, right? But in our third series of production, we were able to receive a nomination for an internationally renowned arts prize, the Cuba Disco. And we also received recognition from the Latin Grammys. For those of you who live in this territory, in this land, if you don't have access to promoting your music, your performance work, then you don't exist, right? And I recall at some point when President Obama gave this declaration, we could not fathom the magnitude of impact on our own cultural production, but streaming platforms like Spotify cut off access to our music. And so we understand that algorithms do affect the way that people are able to access our cultural production, our music. And so it makes you, it obliterates you from being present and being able to circulate your own musical achievements, musical production. And in the Western area, we saw this greatly affected. And so we saw this happen also to other organizations, other performance artists were affected. And so this also became a factor, a cause for migration. So add to that economic asphyxiation and other economic challenges, it caused our people to migrate, our artists, our musicians to migrate. And so that caused a huge blow to our musical production. And so from 2015, let's jump to 2022, we saw Spotify return to Venezuela. And it wasn't a huge announcement or anything. We just happened to see that one day Spotify service became available in Venezuela. And so through there, a few licenses for streaming were granted. Yolimar can speak on this. And so Spotify service became available to the country. But this was after 7 years of being blocked, of Spotify being blocked from circulation in the country. And so this is something that, you all have access to here, but have been unaware that we haven't had that access over in our country. And so we are, engaged in this resistance, in this insurgency across different institutions. And in a university, a national university for the arts that we have in Venezuela, that when crisis comes, we know that the first things that are affected, the first line items that are affected on an educational level, budget cuts always go at the arts first, right? And so in 2008, after several years of efforts, through the efforts of our commander, we were able to highlight the work of a lot of cultural performers, cultural workers, through the platform of this University of the Arts in Venezuela. And so if you all go research the Treasury Department's website, you'll be able to see a list of sanctions placed on our people. And despite that, we have been able to engage in constant operations in our University of the Arts without interruption. And so that is such an important effort. Those of us who work there, we did see a cut in our salaries, right? My salary as a docent was equal to 2 coffees a month, right? And I love coffee, right? But it turns out that even so, as our doors were open, but the students still weren't coming to school, right? Because amidst the protests that were held by people who were asking for these sanctions, and these were funded by external parties, right? There was that barrier, and that barrier to access to our university halls and classrooms. And so this has been, upon seeing that outside forces were financing these protests to provoke a civil war, an internal civil war, even though I'm telling you we are a united people, there have been these efforts to fund these protests and cause internal ruptures. And we saw a lot of damaging consequences around this, such as the death of a comrade who was coming from work from the east of Caracas, and I happened to be taken in by one of these protests that are provoked and financed but by those who are in support of the sanctions. And they happened to and the protesters actually doused him in gasoline and set him on fire, and it was because he was a black man, because of he was an Afro descendant who was also a supporter of Chavez. And so both of those things made him a target of the deep racism that is also very rampant from that side. And it was with the intention to create more rupture and more chaos. But they were not victorious, because amidst all of this, we have stayed resilient, we have stayed strong. But despite our strength and resiliency, we still need those monies that have been stolen from us. We need those sanctions lifted. And if because we are not asking for humanitarian aid, it's because we don't need it, because we have enough resources to provide for ourselves. We have the natural resources to sustain ourselves. And these are resources that we can distribute on a national level. And so this is why we have an indigenous person, a Llanera person, an Afro woman person can be here in front of you and uniting. Because otherwise you would see white middle-class women from Venezuela presenting to you, right? But it's because we are creating these alliances to resist these blockades. In 2007, I suffered a cerebral vascular attack, and I was taken care of by our health emergency services, and thanks to that, I am still alive. And this was actually the cause of my mother's death, and we weren't able to access an emergency care attention, and collectively there have been efforts to relaunch a national healthcare system in Venezuela. But we know that entails years of supporting the educational pipeline that supports a large-scale healthcare system. And so that is in process right now. But unfortunately, due to the lack of those resources, of those services available when my mother was ill, she passed. And we see that happening for so many women. And so we have a brigade of feminist women here because half of the population women are those who have led so much of these efforts. Angie's mom was the one who built the curriculum of how to give classes to indigenous peoples, how to provide medical translation for indigenous peoples, or giving guidance on how doctors should work with indigenous peoples when they don't share the same knowledge on language. And so there's a lot of indigenous people who were coming with health issues that weren't being adequately served by the healthcare system. But her mom was one of the people who built this curriculum. And actually the Smithsonian, the museum here in the U.S., actually presented on her work. And so look at all of the work we have been able to do in comparison to the efforts to asphyxiate, to create a chokehold on our economy. And so through alliances and working with Leonardo, we have been able to provide education as to how these sanctions have really brutalized our ability to thrive. And so what we are explaining in a very brief, synthesized form to you all, there's other women-led organizations who are educating and providing curriculums around what is happening and giving international presentations to promote the lifting of these sanctions. So we want to hold this space for more questions and answers, and I wish you all solidarity.
We need to change our batteries, so if you can turn off your equipment, we can do that. Thank you so much. Tenemos que cambiar las baterías.
Or just lower the volume.
Sorry that went so long. Bueno, si tienen alguna pregunta. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so please get on the line. Y vamos a tener un mensaje especial también de Venezuela y lo voy a explicar en un momento. Yes, we're ready.
Primero, quiero dar las gracias a ustedes estar aquí en solidaridad con nosotros. Nosotros representamos trabajadores. Desafortunadamente, nuestro gobierno no representa a nosotros, pero tu gobierno sí, y se nota. Entonces, gracias. Y gracias por compartir sus historias con nosotros. Mi pregunta es, con todo lo que está pasando ahora, o sea, los Estados Unidos todavía no quiere reconocer a Maduro como presidente, pero tampoco están hablando y pues hablando sobre el petróleo, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cuáles son los cambios que ustedes han visto? ¿Hay menos sanciones ahora? ¿Cómo está cambiando el ambiente ahora que el Estados Unidos necesita petróleo y no quiere pedir a Rusia, ¿no?
Thank you for your question, and we're also grateful that you all are here. So, the sanctions continue. We live in a period that's pretty intense since Obama's policies and their unilateral policies. And so none of those measures have been lifted. And it's what our compañera just commented, to invite you, if you want to know more in detail about these measures, please visit this page of the Department of Treasury so you can see it in detail. So when we were traveling to here, there were some licenses given so that companies and oil companies that are pretty well known throughout the world to reactivate their operations in Venezuela. So for us, that's not enough. It's a small action, and like you said, they agree on these international situation, the issue with the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, the need for the U.S. to assure or maintain their energy supply. So for us, it's not enough. So if these companies or corporations, they were already functioning in Venezuela for many years, as I mentioned. So due to the sanctions, they needed to leave infrastructure operations. There were major firings of staff of these companies. And to come back and pick up again isn't easy. So especially in the area of oil. So this isn't sufficient. So what we want is to get rid of that policies. This decree, the Obama's decree. So there's like an illusion that no, the U.S. is, loosening some of these measures, or there was an agent who came to the U.S. to talk about his interests in Venezuelan oil. But for us, it doesn't mean much or is representative, because what we ask for is that there be a cease of economic blocking against Venezuela, that all measures must be removed because we are not a threat for anyone. Thank you. Quiero decir que me da lástima que no puedo hablar su idioma, pero espero que...
I don't know what I was going to ask you. I'd
pero
just
sí
like
les quiero hacer una
to
pregunta,
say that
y es una
thanks
lástima
for
que no hablo su
coming
idioma,
to
pero les quiero decir
California.
gracias por venir a
You
California.
guys are very, in my mind, the most courageous humans in the world, you know, and in the country that's Venezuela, you guys have really stood up to Goliath, you know, and sadly I'm within in the belly of Goliath, to put it, you know, and put it simply. I just like to also question. I mean, I'm involved in the live music community as well as technology. And you were saying, you were saying about Spotify. I mean, Spotify is very limited when it comes to music that are streamed. They have their limitations. It's like I can barely, you know, when I like type in a name of artist or a band, it doesn't, you know, it's like it slowly appears, you know. So there's some technical issues with Spotify. If you're typing a particular artist or band, I mean, but with YouTube it's no problem. But shortly, I want to not take up this whole minute. So, what is your take of this? You say that 7 years, Spotify, then various forms of platforms is reappearing. I mean, how is that going as far as the technology and the global the global connection under this brutal sanction that Goliath has pretty much put among your community and your country? I mean, can you elaborate more on the situation in the music and the arts of Venezuela? I mean, if you're able to. Thank you.
Bien.
So today, or now, so I'll let him take a seat so he can hear the interpretation and listen to the device. So in regards to the now, to today, we have a platform that was also impacted. Companies such as CanTV they've been annihilated. CanTV is the company, the national telephone company, where we get service and is democratized, and it's Telefónica Venezuela, CanTV, and for many it was the service for that provided phone service and internet. So and then it was democratized, and amongst that is the service that was maintained, and it was a big investment to maintain this company afloat because it was going to be privatized, just like the oil in Venezuela. It became nationalized and it was multiplied. With the arrival of the sanctions, all of the platforms of communications were also brought down. So for example, that's an example, but when your technological platform is also brought down, how do you communicate, right? And so the blocking takes away the platforms for communication. Internet in Venezuela now is the slowest in the region, but and it used to be one of the more updated it used to be the technology that was more on point and advanced. And progressively we expanded, but due to the dependence and colonization, and in 15, 20 years, there were major efforts, but the majority still depended on the services of the US, and that is why. So it was really impacted us because of that dependence and colonization. And we've been expanding, but now it still continues to be a challenge because technology continues to fail. But there is an openness. China, Russia, and these services are transferring some of that technology, and that takes time. In the meantime, there's the communications crisis, but and I'm talking about technology, but we're in that process right now, opening some channels, and we trust and we continue working on this and really understanding these sanctions and how do we unblock things. So now you can hear us and you can embrace our music. That if you want to learn more, then after this conversation, stay with me a little longer, and then I can give you some information about the Centro Nacional del Disco, the Ministry of Music, because we do have libraries, books, and free music that's available. Biblioteca Ayacucho, El Perro y la Rana, and these are names of editorials from Venezuela that their catalog is free and available, and I'm here, and due to time I can't, share all that, but if you can, if you're interested, you can stay after and I can give you that information. So, sound good? Great. Last question. Good afternoon to everyone, and congratulations, and thank you for empowering women, and they will be changing the world in the future. My name is Hector Garcia. I'm part of an organization from Las Vegas. It's called Worker Center, and we work with workers and human rights. And our organization is focused on inclusion, includes everyone. And so we know that imperialism imposes these sanctions and to destabilize communities. And my question is, what are you all working on to empower the people? Because the people save the people. And so that's my question. So what are you all doing? Or what are you doing? What will you do in Venezuela to change things? Because there's problems all over the world if they destabilize what's happening right now with oil. So the people, because there's this destabilization, people migrate. People don't migrate because they want to. They have to. Sorry for talking like this, but it just enrages me. So that's my question. So knowing that you're rich in oil or petroleum, sometimes our countries, for example, if there were refineries with you all, it would be different because you would be sustainable. So what work needs to happen to bring this peace to your country? Well, this work began a long time ago when power was taken. The president, Hugo Chavez, always said, we have the power. He knew that this moment would come and prepared us since that moment that he had power, because before, people didn't know what laws protected us. They didn't know what was in the Constitution. And anytime the Constitution came out and people didn't understand, and why he came out with a constitution, because when he does that shift or change of the constitution, and it's what is law. So if it's what traditionally said by attorneys, which is the Carta Magna, talks about the power of the citizen. And from the citizens' power, the people organize themselves. The organizations have the right and the power to demand and propose laws and policies to make projects. And from there, all these years has prevented from social unrest. And we weren't caught unprepared, but the day that the president left, when he was going into his second treatment, chemo treatment for cancer, I think that was his goodbye, and he sent a really clear message. Remember that you have a country. There will be difficult times ahead, and there will be many who will want to come to unstabilize our country. So the people understood that we needed to prepare ourselves because he wouldn't be in leadership anymore. And everything happened, right? Like in any country, corruption, internal wars. And so I believe that because of that, as people, we have the autonomy and the right and empowerment to decide for ourselves. So that is something that imperialism is never gonna forgive. So the fact that we're conscious that we know that that oil is ours and that resource is ours, because if it wasn't oil, it would be gold, it would be any other resource. And it's the fact that we are aware that that's ours. So the fact that we know that, of what our rights are, and to feel empowered, then the rest will, come along. And the fact that we are continuing to be organized. Thank you so much. So before we close the space, we do have a special message from another compañera who is persecuted by the U.S., Fabriza, and her husband is Alexab, and Alexab is a Venezuelan diplomat and a political prisoner. I think he's in Miami. And Alexandra is in prison because he wanted to feed the people. And this has subtitles. It's in Spanish, so you can read the subtitles.
Soy Camila Fabri y hace casi 2 años un monstruoso agresor se llevó a un miembro de mi familia.
They took my husband and he was kidnapped by the U.S. If I were asked to make a summary about my husband, I would say that my husband, in complicity with Cape Verde, prevented a Venezuelan diplomat have a third mission, humanitarian mission. But another way to say it is that 3 children saw their father go to work. And yet another way is to say that we are in a presence in Latin America, and that is why I want to tell you. What I want to tell you is a little more complex. Since 2015, my aggressors set his sights on my country where my children grow. And they targeted this country as an unusual and escalated it to many levels. And frankly, some of us never imagined this. The aggressions were planned, as the aggressor would later admit to promote violence, which in big quotation marks would be popular. At least this is what some said. But time taught us to translate specifically popular what that actually meant. They wanted to make sure that the aggressor wanted to make every Venezuelan hungry. The intention was to make the people be desperate so that they would react explosively against the government. Whoever knows Venezuela knows the vital comprehension and caring role of women in all areas of life in Venezuela. My aggressor then
Because most of them are breadwinners. The aggressor limited the possibilities of trading, selling products produced in the country. He denied the possibility to negotiate, to use payment and collection systems. Suppliers and buyers were quickly targeted in order to force them not to work with Venezuela, continuing the decline of the domestic market. Venezuelan households are increasingly hit by sanctions.
the coercive measures taken by the aggressive governments against households are unilateral. It is extraterritorial of the laws of the country that affected everyone, but specifically women. Every woman in Venezuela has been attacked by the unilateral coercive measures imposed by the U.S. government and Venezuela. By virtue of this, the Venezuelan government took exceptional measures because something had to be done to avoid more suffering in the home of Venezuelan people. The aggressor was already showing his face and caused anguish to the country's breadwinners. Among these special measures taken by the Venezuelan state, they named my husband, Alex Saab, as an accredited diplomat to represent Venezuela in special missions. This mission sought to get food, medicine, fuel to the country. My aggressor, in turn, intensified his attack against Venezuelan mothers and reached one of his tentacles closer to my family to threaten, blackmail, and persecute us. One of the most incredible moments was when one of Alex's sons was sanctioned on the OFAC list 1 month after his 18th birthday. That is to say, they launched a full-blown attack on a teenage boy. For God's sake, he had just turned 18 years old. The arrival of COVID-19 pandemic presented a new opportunity to the aggressor in its plan against Venezuela. Ironically, the aggressor did not expect discipline, the calm, and the intelligence of the Venezuelan people, the wise decisions of the Venezuelan state in the face of the pandemic. Every woman in every home, every family, and each one calm but always alert, and the government taking action to get what was necessary for the country in order to address this. The economic warfare in parallel with the pandemic. Everyone saw how ships with gasoline heroically arrived in Venezuela, despite the fact that this same aggressor tried to buy off the honor of a crew on a humanitarian mission. Unfortunately, other ships with fuel, masks, and alcohol were stolen by the aggressor like pirates to continue to coerce households to see them suffer. Many people have denounced this. Many are now here, but the hegemonic mass media, being a tentacle of the aggressor, did not hesitate to cover this up. They did not hesitate to lie and hide and defame in order to contribute to this lawfulness, to the nervousness. At the height of the pandemic in June 2020, Alex Saab, as a special envoy on a humanitarian mission to guarantee the arrival of fuel and medicine for the fight against COVID, food and products to Venezuelan households. On that mission, he was kidnapped, tortured, harassed, signaled, accused, and all of his rights were violated. His status as a Venezuelan diplomat was denied in violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. The Vienna Convention was ignored and violated. A diplomat on a humanitarian mission was abducted in a unique, unprecedented, and illogical case. Alex is still being held hostage in the U.S., but as long as he could, he continued to fulfill his mission as a diplomat in the country where he has welcomed millions of migrants who, like me, have been welcomed with open arms by loving the mother of Venezuela. This aggressor is the same one who put at risk the food to feed Venezuelan children, the diapers, the carbohydrates for Venezuelan tables, that even prevented the negotiation and payment for the COVAX system, a war. Unfortunately, women are unfairly exposed to suffer wars in more violent, harmful, and sometimes even irreparable forms. Before the kidnapping in Venezuela, they organized and distributed food throughout the CLAPs, which were much talked about and covered by the media. It was a high, efficient program in the differentiated and direct attention it provided. Of course, most of the coordinators are women who went from home to home, listening to and attending to problems of each family. Our aggressor did not imagine the strength that can only come from the love of Venezuelan women. I am proud to have witnessed one part of the miracle, which is to have prevented our aggressor from executing his plan in its entirety. Our assailant openly admitted through such disreputable spokespeople like Bolton and Mark Esper what we have been and will continue to denounce all along, which is that it is a political persecution against the legitimate president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and against everything that is in favor in strengthening the will of the people. Once Alex was kidnapped, his two eldest children already targeted the aggressor got into my home in the form of uncertainty, because now this aggressor deprives my little daughters of having a normal upbringing, of seeing their father and enjoying his presence, of embracing him, of having him take care and protect them, of not growing up with anxiety. This abuser made it possible so my daughter will not meet her father. This aggressor now follows me and persecutes my whole family just for being close to Alex Saab. The aggressor tries to make us afraid, but solidarity has grown, and now that I know so many courageous women, heads of households, with whom I am united not only by the same aggressor, but also by the resistance and the will to defend the truth, it gives me hope that it's worth to fight with love, that it's worth to defend the oppressed, and that we must fight for equality. And therefore, it is necessary to defend these values. We must do this in as many spaces as possible. I would like to ask you to continue denouncing these attacks, because we can, because yes, we will win. Once again, I thank you for your courage. We are going to win. Free Alex Saab. Free Alex Saab.
Y ese es el final del programa el día de hoy. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí el día de hoy. Un aplauso ahora aquí para los presentadores. And before we all leave, so tomorrow is the last event. They're going to be in the Elysian Park from 2 to 4:30 p.m. DSA LA is hosting it. And if you are listening right now on this
Just look up freealexstop.org and you'll find the petition to sign.